Good morning, everyone, and thank you for finding us in our next technology platform as we really try and make certain that all 650 plus of our colleagues are able to join us for these critically important conversations today. I'm Debbie McKeon, President and CEO of San Diego Grantmakers. I'd like to start off by giving a huge thank you to Kathleen Kelly-Janis, Dr. Mark Ghali, and Dr. Sandra Hernandez for their leadership in kicking us off this morning, and also for everyone's patience as we really took the bold move of holding these critically important conversations in an emerging technology field on the front edge of technology solutions. So thanks for bearing with us. We know there will be bumps, but we know it's critically important that we all have an opportunity to get together. A couple of just quick housekeeping points. First, our schedule will be pushed back 30 minutes, and you'll be receiving notifications from us to keep you up to date on the schedule. And also, since we're using GoToWebinar, please feel free to use the chat box for your questions. We'll be monitoring those and getting those to our moderator, Kathy. It seems a lot of times these days are spent anticipating what will happen next, what will be different tomorrow. In a time of triage and response, it can be hard to find windows for looking back or forward. But today, I can't help but feel a sense of reflection that we're all here together for Philanthropy California's first statewide policy summit. In just 3 short years of our alliance, Philanthropy California's become a formidable force, working together on behalf of our members to increase our impact in building and sustaining thriving, equitable communities throughout our state. I feel incredibly honored to get to work with such high caliber, committed and passionate individuals across all 3 of our organizations and throughout our membership. I'd like to acknowledge 2 former Philanthropy California CEOs, Ellen LaPointe, whose leadership of Northern California Grantmakers was essential to the growth of Philanthropy California, and from San Diego, my colleague and friend, Nancy Jameson, who was there when Philanthropy California was an idea on a napkin and was instrumental in shaping its evolution to where we are today. And now, onto our plenary. The outbreak of COVID-19 has had devastating impacts and really exposed the stark realities of our systems that propagate inequitable relief efforts. Philanthropy has long worked to address inequities, and I think the pandemic has glaringly made obvious just how much more work needs to be done. In the midst of systemic challenges, how do we stand together to challenge the status quo, learning from our experiences to assure we have equitable systems and practices to be better prepared for the next threat? How can we mobilize in the short and long terms to advance civic engagement and build community power? These questions are weighing heavily on my mind and yours, I know. Fortunately for us, we have a powerhouse lineup of incredible women leaders who are living and breathing this work and thinking about these questions every single day. They're here today to provide perspective for what's at stake in 2020 and beyond. Let us know what we can do and share hope for what's possible if we come together. So please join me in welcoming Amy Allison, founder and president of She the People, Sheena Ashley, vice president of nonprofits and philanthropy at Urban Institute, Sonia Diaz, founding executive director of the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Initiative, and our moderator today, Kathy Cha, president of the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund. And so, Kathy, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome, Kathy.
Thanks, Debbie. And thanks to Philanthropy California for bringing us together today. I appreciate everybody's patience as we get through all of the technical difficulties, but now here we are. And I want to welcome you into my home. This is literally our guest room, so I tried to tidy up for 650 friends coming over today. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be together in this moment when philanthropy and the communities that we care about are facing unprecedented challenges. The future is very uncertain, and the only way we're going to get through this is if we come together. So I know many of you have been bold and quick with your COVID-19 rapid response work. So I want to really appreciate everybody for all that you're doing. Thanks to our great panel for being here today. We had some exciting technology, thrilling technology moments this morning, but we're happy to be together. And for those of us who've lived in California for a long time, you know, we're not strangers to crises. We have been through a lot together: earthquakes, fires, mass shootings, epic budget shortfalls, droughts. But I have to say, I think this one's different. It's not like the recent fires where we were all waiting for the air to clear so that we could take off our masks and go back to business as usual. This one's really different. And COVID is giving us a crystal clear view about the problems of what business as usual looks like. Disproportionate deaths among African American and Latinos, anti-Asian racism, a safety net that's shredded, and United Airlines and Ruth Chris Steakhouse getting stimulus funding, but not our local taqueria. So all of our country's problems have been laid bare in the last couple months. And so this is a historic moment. What we are living through is profound and deep. And I think it's going to go down in history like 9/11. We'll refer to pre-COVID, post-COVID down the road. So what does this mean for us, our sector, our nonprofits, for the communities that we care about? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And I have three fabulous panelists joining me to unpack these important issues. Welcome, Amy, Sheena, and Sonia. So let's dig in. Question number one. So many of us have been focusing on the crisis and rapid response. In the earlier session, did a great job to ground us in this moment. And now I want to peek up a little bit and look a little further down the road. What does a post-COVID-19 world look like? And so in the private sector, for example, there's folks talking about online grocery shopping is here to stay, concerns about more privacy and surveillance issues. What's down the road for our space? So that's my first question to our panelists. Looking forward, what are the lasting impacts of this pandemic? How will the nonprofit sector be forever changed? Sheena, since you have a national view, why don't you take it away?
Great, thank you so much for that, Kathy. And I'll start us off just sort of really big picture into two big mindset shifts that I think are going to be the result of the experience that we're having right now with COVID-19. The first is something that I saw in the policy discourse leading up to the CARES Act, and that is sort of a very different perception of the role of the nonprofit sector. In this recovery effort, nonprofits were seen as much more necessary for the economic recovery. We were really looking at them as enterprises, and that shows in the way that the response has included nonprofits, as in this case, as being eligible for SBA loans. Now, this comes with great benefit for the sector. This is something the sector has been advocating for by having better data on the nonprofit workforce and really bringing that into the policy discussions. And it's going to actually give them much more access to a larger base of resources from the federal government. But I think also looking forward, we should be concerned with how that's going to have maybe some drawbacks to the nonprofit sector. Anytime we get close to blurring the lines between what constitutes business, the private sector starts to raise their hands around unfair competition. And so I think after this, there's going to be a broader discussion about what nonprofits really are and what they occupy in the economy. I also think we'll see a shift in the way in which we all think about financial health in the nonprofit sector. You know, we always took for granted the holy grail was that you get earned revenue, and this is what the path towards sustainability was for so many nonprofits. And in this crisis, for the first time, the vulnerability of earned revenue was really made very present to us. And so I believe a lot of nonprofits will start questioning the risk that is also inherent in earned revenue and may start adjusting their strategies. And I think we'll see this in some major shifts in operating reserve policies across a lot of nonprofit organizations. But I also think for that shift to occur, for us to actually see nonprofits learning from this in terms of their risk in their operating reserve policies, that foundations will have to make room for this change from the sector. Right now, empirical studies show that foundations systematically punish nonprofits for having more than 3 months of operating reserves. And so for the lessons of this kind of risk profile to translate to the nonprofits, foundations need to ease up on that and themselves develop a different picture of what financial health looks like.
That's great. And a nugget there for foundations, right? How do we think about reserves and how does that look different in a post-COVID environment? I think that's a really profound one for our sector. Sonia, what about the view from UCLA?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here, and I hope everybody is safe. Really thoughtful comments from Sheena. What I want to add is that we recognize that crisis transforms society. That's pretty clear. And we look at the recession of 2008, and in looking forward towards the looming recession associated with COVID-19, there will be profound effects in every sector, and we've already seen that. In terms of workers, we've studied here in Los Angeles County the impact to the retail and service sectors. Asian Americans and Latinos are devastated in terms of the loss of work, and that is going to wipe out wealth. But there are ways that philanthropy has a key role to play as we're in the throes of this pandemic. And what philanthropy can do to ensure that communities are able to survive and emerge without losing everything is twofold. One, really thinking through how the government is either ignoring or empowering vulnerable communities. And one of the ways that this crisis will magnify the way in which we have unnecessary loss of life or unnecessary loss of wealth is by leaning on civil society organizations as trusted messengers. This year in this conversation prior to the pandemic really focused on the US Census and the 2020 election. There's a framework of advocates, civil society organizations, including community leaders, who had already been taking on this important role to ensure that folks were counted and that they got out to vote. Now during COVID, this is really important for access to information that is accurate and factual, and that's a role for philanthropic organizations and foundations. The other thing is thinking through how policymakers actually have the information necessary, like Sheena was saying, and some of the work that we do at UCLA's Latino Policy and Politics Initiative that centers on race, that centers on equity, and centers on vulnerable communities. The data already shows the disparate deaths that are occurring with COVID. We recognize that some people have access to healthcare. That has always been the case. There's asymmetrical access to COVID-19 testing. But what we know already is that there are certain communities that need our help, and that this pandemic makes clear anybody getting sick means that all of us are at risk of getting sick. So it's really an opportunity to transform the way in which people have access to basic things like health, housing, and wealth. Thanks, Kathy.
Amy, do you want to jump in?
I do. Thank you. Thank you for having me here and being part of this conversation. I just think what Sonia brings up about having a racial justice lens on all the myriad of issues that nonprofits are addressing in terms of serving the community and advocating for policy have to be front and center. This is a moment that, regardless if it's environment or if it's healthcare or education or the economy, that racial justice needs to help to frame what organizations and what projects should be supported in this moment, because it really does make a difference, and it gives us an opportunity, it gives philanthropy an opportunity to take another look at and deeply invest in solutions that are race conscious, since COVID affects Black, Brown, and Asian American, Indigenous communities so profoundly. I also want to say that not all nonprofits are meeting this moment or experiencing the moment in the same way. In the same way that Sheena had said that and Kathy had said that the funding that was available in the package, the funding that's run out, was not equally accessed by nonprofits, that larger nonprofits, better funded nonprofits, who have legal access to legal and much more resources could go in and apply for either SBA loans and other kinds of things. Nonprofits that tend to be led by women and men of color have yet to be recipients of this kind of public support. And so understanding and deeply investing in those organizations who in this moment can take a leadership role in advocating for solutions that take us further than where we've been. Even opening up the idea of universal health care or UBI or other types of support for Asian Americans, civil rights in this moment. Those are the opportunities that we have. I think that foundations have had a way to doing business. I'm sure everybody here has spent time organizing the strategy before COVID came. But I do think that there is more opportunity to take another look at what giving looks like and have both an education, a focus on racial justice, and a civic engagement strategy that breaks down those silos and allows for deeper and more meaningful investment for the communities and the organizations who are supporting those deeply affected by COVID-19.
So the disproportionate impacts are so clear at the nonprofit level, on the business level, and also at the individual level. That stimulus package provided $1,200 per adult, $500 per kid. But for our most vulnerable community members who need it the most, it's very challenging to get that money. And okay, I got a question in the chat that I want to bring up to all of you. Do you think there's going to be more trust-based philanthropy as a result of the pandemic? And it helps us transition to think about some of the opportunities that are out there.
I definitely hope so. I mean, we see with the rapid response effort really good signs of equitable grant making. And my team has been examining the language and the restrictions that different funders are placing on their rapid response grants. And we've been promoting different practices that organizations can use, that foundations can use to distribute their grants. And we're seeing a lot of that being reflected in this. We see, I think, when foundations are doing rapid response, that they have more flexibility. They're willing to take on a lot of the innovations that we've been calling for the field to drive more equity. So we see it there. I think the challenge will be extending that sort of trust-based that we can do for the smaller dollars that we're distributing in this rapid response to our other core funding. And that's where it gets a little bit trickier, and we have to bring our boards in line with their decision making to have a little bit more trust in these organizations. And so it's really not necessarily just what we learn in this rapid response moment, but the extension of some of that to our, as we said before, business as usual. Can it change what business as usual actually is? And so that is to be seen.
And I think for philanthropy, as we think about a post-COVID world, is it possible that this kind of speed, less restrictive grant making becomes part of that new normal? Let me move to our second question. You know, because of COVID-19, we have seen in 4 weeks, unemployment claims hit 2.7 million people just in California, and that is 1 out of 7 workers. It is mind-boggling. And economists are estimating that unemployment rates in California could hit 15 to 20%. And that's after we've been at 3 point something or hovering around 4 during this growth of the past few years. So things are very grim, and especially for families and individuals who are teetering on the edge before this virus hit. So it's going to get worse, and it's profound. But I also want us to be hopeful about how disruptive crisis moments like these help us challenge the status quo. And so what opportunities are out there? Sonia, do you want to start?
Yeah, one of the things that I recalled from the Great Recession was the willingness for cross-sector partnerships, not just private and philanthropic, but governmental. And I think we saw a really big example of that last week here in California with the California Immigrant Resilience Fund that will ensure a portion of the state's undocumented workers, about 150,000, will receive a benefit because they are explicitly ineligible under the Federal CARES Act, which, as you recall, was $2 trillion. And Californian families were ineligible if they were even a mixed status family, even if they paid taxes. And what we know about the pandemic, again, is it's affecting all of us. If people are sick, cannot afford healthcare, that means that the virus will continue to spread. And so this fund in particular leverages the power of philanthropy to make good on a promise that our government should work for all of us, not just for some. And it ensures that government dollars are directed to those most vulnerable. So instead of replicating what Congress did here in California, this was a very intentional act to fill in some gaps. Now, in the midst of a crisis, it can often feel like everything is falling apart, and it's about getting back to normal instead of creating something new. I think the real opportunity here is re-envisioning something that works for all of us and allowing us to see the areas where we have the biggest gaps. You mentioned unemployment. We were already dealing with the state with just abject poverty and inequality, with rising homelessness, whereby the state of California represented half of all housing insecure people in the nation. This was before the coronavirus. Now, as we get back to normal, I don't want to go back to that because it's not normal. And so we need to underscore where vulnerable communities are, and they often are our workers. And so one of the demographic realities here is that Asian and Latinos are the fastest growing demographic groups in the state. They're the future workforce, and yet research that we've been undertaking at UCLA as rapid response shows that they're the hardest hit. And so how will California continue to be the 5th largest economy in the world if its workforce and families are suffering? So I'd love, to think through this as an opportunity. The policy window is open. Let's not replicate the wheel, and let's not get back to normal.
That's great. Sheena, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I would love to think about some hope and opportunities that are part of this. I'm getting a little bit overwhelmed with the challenges that are coming. I will speak to the policy space, given that that's what I know best. And I really do see some policy windows opening up in this time, particularly with the way in which we're dealing with this recovery. I see an opportunity for expanding universal basic income. I mean, and to be clear, the cash payments that we have right now are not UBI. It's really the same kind of recovery payments that we've done in the past. But what's different here is I feel like the government is trying to think a little bit better about the mechanisms for finding the individuals and targeting particular individuals who need to receive these payments. And that mechanism that we build for these particular cash payments will lay the foundation for the UBI to come. And so the administrative barrier has been for so long that we can't really figure out a way to target it. We can't get the payments out quickly. We can't adjust it to the income. And we're trying to build some of that mechanism right now. So I'm very hopeful that this will create more policy opportunity for UBIs to move forward, because with the joblessness we see right now, we know that this is still part of the tidal wave to come with accelerating technological change and all the other job eliminations that's going to happen even without this crisis. We know that was going to come because of technology. The other opportunity, and I think we pay a lot of attention to the issues that are happening in our cities. So I just want to highlight some opportunities for rural areas as well, in particular, expanding rural healthcare and access to health in the health workforce in rural areas. We saw with this COVID-19 response an opening for rural hospitals to be considered as part of the package. They now have access to $50 billion that they were restricted from before because they did not have the proper designation. There was a Rural Hospital Closure Relief Act in 2019 that was placed forward to try to accelerate that, but they didn't get the momentum. Now with this recovery, it did. So there's a great opportunity to stand up for rural hospitals and to really help them leverage this funding that they have available to sustain that kind of really critical infrastructure that we need in these places. And the last thing I'll highlight is the innovation that has come, I think, through telemedicine and telelegal. that we are seeing people have to access now out of necessity. These were things that were being done in really remote areas before, like Alaska, and now we all need to do it. And these kind of innovations can go a really long way in helping folks have access to healthcare and to access to more justice for millions of vulnerable families who just can't access the legal opportunities that they need, or can't really make the court date because they're working 3 jobs. And so now that we have access to telelegal, I think that's going to create a whole new opening for people to get the kind of civil legal aid that they've been needing in this country.
That's helpful. Thank you. Amy, do you want to jump in?
I do. That laundry list of possibilities is an agenda many of us have been working on in California for a long time. In some ways, we can say California is a leader, recognizing and arranging payments to people without immigrant like paperwork. Different, a broader swath of people is a very important start. It's necessary but not sufficient. We could look at the innovations California won, really a decade ago. Voter registration and vote by mail in this state have opened up opportunities that other states and other jurisdictions are looking at as a model for where they're going to go for November. But I think there's an opportunity for philanthropy to embrace 2 things broadly. One is that the courageous leadership that we're seeing in this state and across the country is coming from women of color as a particular group of people. And I want to say that because it's very important to both identify the leaders who are defining and working for an agenda, both in California and nationally, that helps us to realize some of the changes that we want to see us come through as a result of this crisis, and to acknowledge the crisis is going to be long lasting. Who are the new voices that the community is going to be looking for leadership, to expand the imagination, and actually for policy implementation? And philanthropy can do a lot in terms of validating and supporting the platforms of these leaders across the state. The second thing is that I know with She the People, this has been a big focus of ours. We cannot underestimate the power of narrative right now. When I watched the news and I saw, not only in Huntington Beach, but in places across the country, groups of organizers saying, with a message, protesting and being very anti-science, saying that we should go back to some kind of normalcy in the face of more than 40,000 people dying. This is a reality that we are in. Philanthropy can underscore and support extremely strong narrative that's coming, that's fact-based, science-based, that elevates indigenous, Latinx, Black community, others, and leadership. And I think that is often narrative kind of gets shunted off to the side as an add-on. I think for us to really have the full conversation about the possibilities for our policies and for our communities, we have to have build strong platforms and have strong voices that can take us through. Because when Kathy talks about the unemployment rate, when Sheena talks about the unemployment rate, we know that this is not something that our state or our country is going to recover from in a few months. And so in that chaos, to your point, Kathy, is a place for us to be clear about the solutions that would bring us to a new place. And I think philanthropy has just a key role in making that happen.
That's great. I want to bring in a question from the chat that's really related to new voices and a new narrative. What are the critical stories related to COVID, inequity, vulnerable communities that you think we should lift up to the media as we try to shape a narrative for a new place and a new normal?
I'm going to just jump in and say one of the most profound changes in California that we should be pushing on is there is no reason for there to be homeless people. We just demonstrated.
Yep. We just took them all into the motels. That's right.
House homeless people because it was a public health necessity. It is also a necessity for our community, not just public health, but for all the reasons. that there should be no homelessness in California. And when we think about the power of that statement in the face of, a generation of people giving us reasons why it's too expensive, it's not practical, we cannot do it, then we realized what the possibility is in terms of narrative and getting people to understand, hey, there's this whole new possibility around ending homelessness in our state. And that's just one of many examples.
Yeah, one of the things for me is workers and essential workers, whether it's the gig economy, it's our grocery stores, it's custodians and janitors cleaning buildings. These make it clear that a fight for 15 is not something that is unnecessary nor undeserved. And in fact, we need more. The other thing is recent research shows that women of color overwhelmingly are on the front lines of our workforce. What does that mean in terms of their ability to fully fund opportunity for their families when they are underpaid and we're still suffering from egregious equal pay inequality? Now, the other thing I was thinking about was really thinking through home care. Those of us that are having to work from home and able and privileged to, and have the duties of either elder or younger family members, the job, the resources, and the necessity for all of those tasks in care are clearer than they ever were. And I think that any type of misogynist language that is women's work and or that it is invisible work, no, it's work. And it gets in the way of being able to fully function. So I think that these narratives of what it's like to work from home and or work during COVID and have to care, and then also being on the front lines when you don't have access to affordable quality healthcare as a worker. These things are incongruent, and it means that if we don't close these policy loopholes, this pandemic, which will likely have a second wave later this year, is going to hurt us even harder.
That's great. Can I pile on one more? It's so many narratives to shift, but I would say the narrative of generosity. So much of what we look at to understand generosity is charitable giving, but what we're seeing in this response is the folks who are practicing mutual aid, the people who have stayed in communities, those who have left their communities to their second and third homes, who also get all of the benefits in the charitable giving tax law in order to receive positive benefits for that charitable giving. And then the smaller donors or people who are ignored by these policies are the ones who are sticking in there and being generous through their giving, their purchasing, their support of their local restaurants, all of the things that they're doing to really show that what it means to invest in organizations and in each other, that's happening through people in their daily activities and not necessarily something just for the ultra wealthy to do, to be seen as philanthropists. So I think the narrative of generosity and what constitutes philanthropy will also be a narrative that we can shift given what we've exhibited through this response.
That's great.
That's great.
And it's really, you all laid out a lovely balance between new thinking about age-old problems, homelessness, African Americans having such poor access to healthcare and being asset poor, thinking newly about those communities, as well as new solutions like tele-everything and digital and innovate. So I think that's a great balance. We have a lot of questions from the chat that are related to the elections because we want all these voices and all these voters to be heard. So let me transition there. That is the next big thing coming down the road. Despite coronavirus, we still have the most consequential election in many of our lifetimes. And I would love to hear you all brainstorm about power building strategies so that we can ensure to hear all these voices, marginalized communities, and have them turn out as voters. And Amy, I'm going to turn it to you first. Bread and butter work.
Yes. Thank you for the question because, my work has been organizing women of color who have a very unique role in democracy as high turnout voters, voters who will make a difference in the election, particularly in battleground states, but also in California down ballot, and kind of super voters who bring their family and communities along, as well as organizers on the ground. So, I've been focusing on women of color because of the role in democracy that hasn't been acknowledged, but is very important to build. And I think focusing explicitly on women of color gets philanthropy further down in terms of lots of things. But also, I just want to have a honest conversation about the way that funding's been organized, because I've been in multiple conversations with potential funders around, you got C3 funding around voter education, you have C4 funding around advocacy. And my challenge is to think about the necessity of both coming into the November election. Not only are we facing, and I know because we're working on the ground in many of the states that have already had their elections moved. And, California, we had a primary and it was on time, but for Georgia and other states, it was pushed to June. Many of us think not only the primary, but the general election is going to be negatively affected by COVID-19. The fact of the matter is we need to bring millions of people into a place where they can understand the steps in their own state, not only to register, but to become vote by mail voters. And in some places, it's very complex. Like Georgia, I use as an example, there are 5 steps in order to do that. In California, it requires, even though everybody gets a ballot, for education about when that, how to get that, back to be counted. On the other hand, on the C4 side, advocacy, direct advocacy for a political agenda, I think is directly tied, because if you think about it, just focusing on women of color, which are a quarter of the voters in many of the states now, as the states become majority people of color, it's very important to think about the issues and the political results that motivate voters to actually come to the election. So my challenge for philanthropy is rethinking the responsibility of a philanthropic organization in terms of education and inspiration to get people to vote. What the country needs is to hear from our communities, high vote turnout. And high vote turnout is going to have an impact on the November elections, no doubt about it. But with COVID-19, it's requiring us to do things like we're doing at Chi the People, where you got to lean into digital. We have to figure out a way where we used to do a lot of events. We're not going to have a lot of events. How are we, in some places we have lots of organizers knocking doors. That's not going to happen. So really supporting organizations who are creatively figuring out how to identify, educate, and motivate voters through this very difficult time is going to help us not only make sure people have a voice in the democracy, they're actually voting, overcoming significant voter suppression that we're seeing in lots of parts of the country, but also in the same way that COVID-19 is having us rethink things like, I think Sheena was mentioning, telemedicine. We need to rethink what participating in democracy looks like. And this is a perfect opportunity for us to deeply invest in these creative new ways for us to come out of this with much more democracy, which is more people showing up and making their voices heard November and beyond.
And Amy, if I could add, one of the things that's really important is that there isn't universal vote by mail in all of our states. And in fact, even in California, some of our local jurisdictions are far more advanced than others. And what this means is there needs federal dollars. This needs to be part of any COVID response out of Washington, D.C. But in terms of the philanthropic community, it's really thinking through how we can expand grants in the near term to get those local agencies up and running. Because, and this is what's at stake, there is going to be a second wave of this virus that will likely happen in the fall. We have already been talking about physical distancing. You cannot expect voters in the state of California to wait 2 hours in line to cast a ballot, as we did on Super Tuesday, let alone even more hours in places like Wisconsin or Georgia or Florida or Texas or Arizona. And it's unsafe. And democracy should not trigger death. And so we fundamentally need to get behind the science in that there is a viable alternative, which is vote by mail. But to get to Amy's point, there are sectors of our electorate that need outreach. We have a lot of first-time voters, particularly young voters of color or folks that are naturalized. We see that with the Latino electorate. We saw their power in 2018 and then again in this primary, but also Asian Americans and others. So that means that language access that one could expect in a polling booth needs to happen in the mail. That means our civil society organizations that were already doing the hard work for getting out the count should now be getting rapid response grants to learn how to vote by mail. It's not easy, especially if you're a first-time voter, and we need to be cognizant. So this is a place where philanthropy can make an impact, get those local agencies up and running, but also have trusted messengers.
And this is an opportunity for us to use our digital natives, our young people who are going to be graduating high school and college into a recession period. And so
who need jobs.
So utilizing them for this. This is an opportunity where philanthropy can step in and create career pathways and mentorship for young people so that this isn't a lost time for them. They can be active in this greatest moment of our time right now, come November, and it will ignite them for voting, but also empower them to be participants in this democracy process in their own communities. And so that's something I would definitely encourage, and not leaving them on the sidelines, but really bringing them into the center of these activities to mobilize their friends and their families and their communities into this election time.
I agree. And I think the other place where we can help is because we have pre-registration in California. We've had 500,000 young people pre-register to vote before they turn 18. But imagine turning 18 now, the election looks very confusing, and we're going to be faced with disinformation about, you know, this canceled, this closed, this whatever, and how can they engage their peers so that those 500,000 can vote immediately. The last thing I just want to mention, we could talk about the election all day, and it's a favorite topic of mine, but we have some very powerful structural items coming up on our ballot. And the one that I would mention that many in philanthropy should care about is schools and communities first. Prop 13, loophole reform, if it passes, $12 billion will go into the hands of schools and communities. It's an incredible structural reform. And there's a lot of C3 public education about fiscal policy that can be done. And there's a lot of straight up C4 vote yes that can be done. So I hope folks are thinking about that deeply. Let me shift to, you've already, all of you have done a good job of offering philanthropy some sage advice that I hope folks take away with them today. But I want to give you another opportunity to share with this audience of 650 people, what is the role of philanthropy in this brave new world? Amy, do you want to start?
Not to overstate it, but philanthropy can save democracy. We have the most significant threat to our ability to vote and our ability to have elections. None of us have ever experienced elections moving. And I think that the danger is that, to Kathy's point about the disinformation, the confusion, the fear that's overwhelming right now, all of us stuck in our homes as we continue the quarantine, that democracy itself, the fact that we have elections, that people participate in those elections is at risk. And in a way that is the foundation and the core issue that without that, we can't really do anything. And because philanthropy has an ability to tap resources and provide infrastructure for those who can, who have implement plans to strengthen democracy right here in California and nationally, there's a unique role for philanthropy. I encourage a real rethinking about how to use that power in the next few months in order to step in at this greatest moment where, you know, we have our state, and our state is trying to face the pandemic in the way that makes sense for our 40 million residents, but we have a lack of federal expertise and leadership, and that vacuum needs to be filled. I believe philanthropy can come in powerfully right now.
Thank you. Sonia, what about you?
Yeah, you know, one of the things is that this is laid bare disparities, especially as it relates to vulnerable populations and communities of color. And when I think about recovery, we can't leave them and us behind again. And I want to bring a personal story as a young leader, which is that I got my policy start at Latino Issues Forum when I graduated college, right when the Great Recession started. LIF closed its doors in large part because of the impact of the recession and banking and mortgage and housing lenders on civil society organizations. Nonprofits will close. Now, what I don't want to happen, where I think philanthropy and our state leaders can really impart some leadership here today, is that we don't go 10 years without a statewide advocacy and research organization focused on the state's plurality, which is what happened when civil society really transformed after the Great Recession. When I founded the Latino Policy and Politics Initiative, there was a huge gap, which didn't make sense because it meant that communities and data about demography, about geography, and about race were just not included in decision-making in Sacramento. And that leaves us all further behind, even if we're dealing with well-intentioned leaders that are not making policy based on racial animus. So my call out is, let's make sure that voices aren't silenced for another decade. Let's think about that. I'm thinking about the Asian American community. I'm thinking about the indigenous community that has just a lack of healthcare. I'm thinking about, Black female mortality rates. All of the organizations that are working on these issues need to continue to work on these issues as we see each other in community again.
Thank you.
That's great. And I think my points will just echo something that Amy said earlier, and it's really having foundations step into their roles vis-a-vis government. I mean, I think at this point, we don't have the luxury of choosing, as Amy was saying, do we do 5C3 or C4? We have to do all of it. And foundations have a role to be complements, supplements, and have an adversarial role with government. And we really need to think about all three of those. Where are the holes and where is government not filling them so foundations can step in? Where can foundations leverage the work that government is doing and build on top of that as complements? And then where's government getting it wrong? And we need to hold them accountable. We need to push back against what they're doing and hold and shine a light on the people that are being left behind. And I think every foundation needs right now to make in their strategy all three of those roles for us to not leave any of this left behind, as Sonia was saying. I think it's really imperative right now to be active in all of those.
That's great. We have gotten a lot of really fantastic questions on the chat. I'm going to lift up a couple of them. What have we learned from other disasters, Katrina, HIV/AIDS, fire, Sandy, about how to help new leaders, community leaders emerge and develop?
Right, I will definitely start on that one, especially doing research on the way giving shifts in disasters. And we know that, especially, and this is different because the disaster is everywhere. This is the first of our kind where everybody's been affected and everything is disaster response. So I think it's going to look a little bit different here than it does in the past. But after 9/11, research showed that giving really moved toward those issues that were disaster related and was very suppressed in everything else. And it took 2 whole years for the normal state of giving to come back to normal, for that rebound to happen. And so we know that the money moves toward even the first movers and those who get to reorient their work and say that they're doing a disaster response. I think, as Sonia and Amy said earlier, we can't afford to move away from the work that was critical being done before. So right now we have to think about everything being disaster related and still continue that kind of giving, or trying to find opportunities to bring, if we can't give to those areas, still to bring a spotlight on what they're doing, or to convene them virtually so the voices are all there. And the other thing is to let those leaders lead and not be a part of our framework of what it means for that leadership to happen. So if they're saying, this is what my community needs, we're seeing this in Appalachia right now. A lot of what they're calling for recovery doesn't look like what we're saying recovery is. And so they're being excluded from the opportunities. We have to trust their voice, trust that they are knowing what their communities want and that looks like what they need, and be responsive to them rather than having them fit into our frame of what that looks like.
I have a couple of questions around the reality of digital and innovation and what we need to do, juxtaposed against many of our communities don't even have basic internet access. I mean, we're seeing that with public schools across the country right now. So what can philanthropy do? How are the elections and other issues affected by this digital reality in our community?
Yeah, I think that this shows that, access to the web is a basic utility, that it falls in line with telecommunications, which, at least in terms of, landline phones and other matters, have been a place for advocacy, a place for community benefits, and we need to rope this type of new technology into that framework so that any sort of utility hikes, et cetera, and access are actually meaningfully dealt with. And so this is something that philanthropy can help in terms of the advocates that are doing that work. And I think in terms of the digital divide, it's a divide, like Amy said, of just homelessness too, and housing. I have students whose universities have closed and they've gone online. Not everybody has a computer or a microphone or a headset or a space or a desk, and we need to remedy that.
I like that. It's a very powerful narrative shift to go from thinking about internet access as a basic utility, just like no more homeless people. There's a moment of opportunity there. Amy, jump in.
I was going to say, just to underscore what Sonia was saying, this is a moment for philanthropy to make it so that there's universal Wi-Fi access. Mm-hmm. Even during the pandemic, there isn't a place where everyone has a phone. Most people have a phone, some kind of phone, but a lot of people on the communities that we're trying to activate, have limited data, and so it's both universal Wi-Fi access and also figuring out a way to open up the pipeline of data that comes to people's phones, because that's, we look at the next few months. I know our work is in identifying, particularly through social and through voter files and map to consumer files of data, how to get in touch with community and educate people about how to vote by mail, when the dates are, what are the issues, what's on the ballot. Without this kind of very quick commitment to expanding access, we're going to have a hard time bringing people to the polls, for November, and educating people in all of the ways that we're going to need to do.
Gina, I have a final question for you. That it's such a great fit because of your national view and the fact that you're in DC. Is there an opening and maybe a need for us to reimagine philanthropy's role? Could we think about new laws that remove the restrictions in funding public policy, et cetera? Can you imagine any possibilities for laws that take us to a different role for philanthropy?
I do. I really do. And I think there's a great opening for those conversations to happen, particularly around foundations in impact investing and the larger set of assets that they have. I think really when we expand the thought around the portfolio and seeing the power of that endowment to be able to participate in things like loans, equity sharing, the things that are the supports for this economy moving ahead, I think there's a really rich time for foundations to think about some of those restrictions being lifted in that space that allow for much more of that to happen. I also think that there's ways, and this is an opportunity when philanthropy steps up in this moment to demonstrate that they can be sort of trusted partners to community, so they have that broader community support behind them to push for some of these changes in laws. A lot of this is as a fear when we think foundations, wealthy individuals, endowments, all in the same breath, that they cannot be trusted to, and so this is why there are these restrictions on their roles and their giving and the like. But I think there's an opportunity to open that lens and for people in community to understand what foundations bring to the table, how are they different, who they're accountable to, and to demonstrate some of that accountability in this moment. I know that it's always scary for foundations to want to open the regulatory box and to think about being able to shape those conversations in Washington when it comes to the lens being on them and not necessarily just the issues that they care about. But I do feel like there has to be, especially as we move into the economic down cycle and the impact it's going to have on foundations themselves, that we really see this as an opportunity to think about removing some of those restrictions on foundation activities, and so that we can see more flexibility in the response. Absolutely.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, let me close with this. In this crisis, our criminal justice system is releasing inmates. Like we said, homeless people are being moved to motels. And I love that farm workers, grocery store workers, other low-wage workers are being deemed essential, as they should be. And so I want to leave our audience with this question: what can we do to take advantage of these opportunities and make permanent shifts in thinking and policy and get to this new place? Not business as usual, not that old normal that was incredibly inequitable, didn't work for most of us, a new place. And what does that new place look like? So I know our sector can walk and chew gum. And so we can help provide this immediate relief, just like you all are doing, and have a strategic eye down the road for possible structural changes. And that's what I would ask for everybody today. We are in this moment, we have a crisis, but we need to also have an eye for the future. And there are, more than 600 of us here who have influence, money, aren't satisfied with this status quo. So let's use that to create a new post-COVID world that strengthens our democracy, builds our resilience, is more equitable, and shifts power. So I want to give, ladies, if this was a room full of people, the crowd would be going crazy for you right now. There's virtual applause everywhere. You can't hear it, but let me just say, I know there's appreciation for you all, so thank you so much. And let me just do a couple of more virtual housekeeping things because our schedule is off a little bit. So now morning breakout sessions are going to start at 11:40. So please see the links in your email. Afternoon breakout sessions are starting at 12:45, back on the regular schedule, and links are going to be sent out by email for that too. And look at this, Philanthropy California wants me to do a plug for a Schools and Communities First webinar on May 14th. So please stay tuned for details in the email and in the chat, and feel free to engage your colleagues virtually. Pick up the phone later, Zoom with somebody and say, hey, that was really interesting. What could we do to make sure there are no homeless, to strengthen this democracy, etc. So please reach out, please take these lessons. And thank you, Amy, Sonia, and Sheena, so much.
Thank you so much, Kathy.
Everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Stay safe, take care, be healthy.